Africa and, of course, the continent of Africa, we're gonna travel across the world to America. Our first American speaker of the day, I believe. His name is Luke Broyles. He's come all the way from Michigan via Costa Rica and New York down to Cape Town. Please give him a warm welcome to the stage where he's going to make the case for Bitcoin. Luke, the floor is yours. Do you want this or a letter?
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yes, like Joe said, I've come from a long way. Typically, when I go to these conferences in Canada or the US or Latin America, it's people from elsewhere, Europe or Africa that, or Asia that have come the long way. So now it's kind of nice to be on the other side. And something else I've noticed too with this conference so far today is it's very different than the ones I've been to in the last year or so. This conference by far is the fewest Americans and Canadians. Typically, over in North America and even in Latin America, there's a lot of Canadians and Americans. So here there's far less. I've also noticed it's a far younger crowd, so that's awesome. And there's, I think, the highest percentage of women in this crowd too. So in all these factors, this is a very interesting conference. It's very nice. And how many people, this is your first Bitcoin conference ever today? I think that's pretty awesome. That's like almost all of you. So anyway, I'm very excited to be here. Very excited for this very different dynamic, and I am going to make this presentation today more from the American perspective, but I think that it's going to be really applicable here. Obviously, here in Cape Town, of South Africa, you guys are part of the BRICS or the BRICS movement, right? Trying to get currency back to a better standard, and I think Bitcoin is obviously going to be the even brighter light in that standard, right? I've been talking to a lot of people today, many different countries, here, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, elsewhere here in Africa. And I think that this problem of political currency is a really critical issue here, globally, obviously, but particularly here in Africa. So without further ado, I need my clicker. I don't know which button to push. Next. All right. So what is the problem we're trying to solve? I argue that Bitcoin is the most important innovation of the 21st century. And the reason why is that it all comes down to energy, right? Energy is the way at which we communicate information and value with each other, both across space and time, right? Obviously, humans from the very early days in ancient civilizations, we stored energy because energy is what we need to live, right? We need oxygen, we need food, we need housing, we need to protect these things. What do we protect these things with? We protect these things with weapons, with shields, with bows and arrows and stones. Now today we have nuclear missiles, ICBMs, and guns, right? Guns and tanks, right? So throughout all of time, energy is the thing we need to survive, and energy is the thing at which we project power and use power with each other. And these four men on the screen here, on the left, of course, we have Tesla, 1899 and 1900, predicted Bitcoin. He was the first person, at least that I believe he's the first person that predicted aspects of Bitcoin. Then we had Ford, 1921, and then we had Hayek and Friedman after them, and basically all of them predicting the same thing, that up to this point in human history, we have had political forms of money, and what they all predicted is eventually we will achieve a numerical apolitical form of money, which I believe is Bitcoin. So over the course of the second half of the 20th century, we went from just predictions to actual attempts that we would make this thing. So we had dozens of attempts, actually over 40 different attempts of creating Bitcoin in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, even the early 2000s. Then, of course, we have the creation of Bitcoin in 2008, 2009. And so this is a chart of human history in terms of political currency. Obviously, this isn't fully comprehensive, but it's a really good example, I think, of emphasizing the problem. The problem that Bitcoin is solving is not faster payments, cheaper payments, or ease of use. However, I believe all those things are true. The critical problem that Bitcoin solves, and the critical problem that all those men and all those attempts are trying to achieve, was making money apolitical, right? So here in South Africa, on my flight over here, it was a very long flight, as Joe said. It was over 13 hours. And the gentleman I was sitting next to was a South African. He was born and raised here. He eventually moved to the United States. And he explained to me that he moved to the United States, started a family there, has many kids over in America now. And he emphasized to me that the problem is that in the last 15 years, South Africa, he feels, has been on a downward slope. He remembers when he was a kid, it was on an upward slope, but now he feels like things are beginning to crumble, and it kind of breaks his heart coming back every 6, 12 months or so and seeing just everything being a little bit worse. And I would argue that all comes down to this, right? Here in America, many of my American friends feel this happening in America, European friends, Canadians, obviously here in Africa. The fundamental problem is that a society is built up there's increasing productivity, and the way at which we communicate energy within that society is via political means, political currency, and eventually, because all human beings have sin, are broken, have flaws, and ultimately we all like to do things in our own advantage at the expense of others, we eventually shift and tilt and distort and manipulate and corrupt that currency a little bit every year. In America, our stated rate of corruption, which most people understand as the standard rate of inflation, is about 2%. Here in Africa, it's much worse. It could be 10% a year, it could be 20%, 30%, 50%, 80, 90, 99%. It could be much, much higher here in Africa and the rest of the world because compared to the United States, you guys have far larger militaries and much smaller relative economies. And so we can leverage that distortion for you. And so the emphasis with this chart is that the status quo for the last few thousand years is that we have resets of political currency every so often. And what you'll notice is that it's getting faster and faster as the rate of technological change is also getting faster and faster. And so the question is, in the post-World War II era, we've had the United States be the booming beacon for global reserve currency standard since 1944 and after 1971 with those last two monetary resets. America's been king of the world when it comes to printing money and then taking those printed numbers and exporting it onto the rest of the world. You know, we print money and we export it onto you guys, right? Like I'm coming here with my American dollars in my back pocket and I'm feeling pretty great, right? Because everything for me is much cheaper and, you know, unfortunately, it's much cheaper for me than it is for most of you in the audience here because I'm coming with freshly printed currency from the monetary capital of the world, Washington, D.C. So the question is, what happens when a political currency resets? This chart here, again, is from America. Obviously, this is the best country in the world, or at least that's what they say, right? This is the best currency in the world. This is the best military in the world. And still, this is what the chart looks like. On the left, you have the Revolutionary War of 1775, back in America's creation. And what you'll see is that after 1971, in the United States, and therefore even exponentially more in the rest of the world, currencies became detached. The reason they became detached was because we detached these political currencies from gold or from oil, or from things that were more fundamental. Now today we claim we have a petrodollar standard, so it's kind of attached to oil, but not really. Political money is fully political promises today. And again, this is America. This isn't you guys here in South Africa. This isn't the rest of Africa here. This is the best political currency in the world, and that's what the chart looks like. And that chart, by the way, is outdated about 15 years, so you can imagine how much more dramatic it would be today. Now, because political money is corrupted, what do we use to store energy? I was just talking to some guys about half an hour ago about how in Malawi and Zambia, they store energy in their houses, right? Most people here understand, at least in my experience talking to you all, most people here understand that house prices keep doubling and doubling and doubling, not because the houses themselves are getting more valuable, but because the currency you're pricing in is going down. Now, us rich, spoiled Americans really haven't caught on to that yet, right? We still think that the stocks go up every year, roughly about 7%, because everything's getting better by 7%. But in reality, we fail to miss that the real inflation rate is roughly about 7.5%. So Americans still have a little ways to catch on, but you know, this is our forms of savings, right? Here in Africa, it might be gold or it might be real estate more so, and those things are monetized in the U.S., but mostly it's American companies. Our grand S&P 500, the NASDAQ, the Dow, these are forms of proxy money because we can't use our political currency for saving energy. So the money supply in blue, the S&P 500 in green, both of these y-axes are on the same log scale. So that's a pretty accurate chart overlaying why the stock market goes up exponentially. It's because we print political currency exponentially. And the point is, if you want to solve corruption in government, if you want to solve the incentive structures, first you have to solve the incentive structures of money, right? You know, political money makes every political power even more powerful, right? A huge part of why the United States is so powerful is because we can print money onto the rest of the world, right? Or let's take France, right? Obviously, France and many other European nations were colonizing Africa, you know, actually relatively recently in the global stage, which is a surprise to my American peers. But even still today, in my opinion, there is still a form of colonial money, right? There are 14 African nations whose currency is directly and solely controlled by the French. And so my question is, why is it that the French in Paris with their Eiffel Tower and croissants, why do they get to determine the currency for 14 different African nations, right? Why do they get to print numbers and exchange those numbers for your oil or for your diamonds or for your labor, right? And so when you have corrupt money, you incentivize the increasing corrupt incentives, which then filters out to society, which then reinforces the incentives and then reinforces people voting back corruption into power. We see this in America, you see this here in South Africa, and most of the world sees this happen. So to run through some brief examples, again, 1913, 1944, 1971, these are three critical points. You can see 1944, when America reattached political currency to gold, wealth inequality went down dramatically. And then when we detached it, it went back up dramatically. This is a huge part of why people in South Africa, China, Brazil, everywhere in the BRICS wants to reattach gold to political currency, because political currency on gold is less bad than political currency by decree alone. Same chart, different colors. You can see this is true with the top 1% and top half of the top 1%. If the yellow line here is gold, this is these are a few examples of major political currencies against that gold. We can see again after 1971 when the U.S. led the way at destroying political currencies, because every other political currency is a derivative of America's. We see that the wealth harvesting, the taxation, the inflationary theft, and the extortion of the globe increased exponentially in the 1970s and has since there. And even though those lines are smaller at the bottom right, it doesn't mean that the percentage-based losses are any less, right? Because this is on a linear scale. You know, the difference between a 99 versus a 99.9% loss is not 0.9%, it's another 90%, right? So even though all these currencies have fallen 99%, they'll fall another 99%. And then they'll fall another 99%. And people don't yet understand this. Real estate, in terms of political currency, is going up forever. Stocks are going up forever. Gold is going up forever. And Bitcoin is going up forever. And including tomato soup. This is tomato soup. The price of tomato soup is going up forever. This is the price of food and fruit and electricity. The cost of these things is going up forever in political currency. The gap between productivity and compensation is going up forever in political currency. Real wages will never keep up with GDP forever at an exponentially increasing rate. And when it comes back to impacting society, we have a population problem. Less so here in Africa, but in the United States, Japan, much of Europe, and Australia, we see birth rates declining. They've absolutely collapsed. Why? Because we have the exponentially increasing need for dual working household incomes, less time for family. This means more payment has to go to childcare, college, and other things that are increasingly expensive. And what happens when you have a lower birth rate? The next generation doesn't replace as much, right? You have lower productivity. You have a higher ratio between retirees and new people entering the workforce, and thus increasing the incentive for further destroying the political currency. Simply put, political currency will continue harvesting gains from the future generations for today's consumption until the precise moment where there's no future left. Same thing with house prices. They go up forever. Same thing in Boston. Same thing with the S&P ratio. Schiller, stocks have never been more overpriced than they are right now. And the same thing with speculation versus production, right? In Latin America, unfortunately, in Latin America and the U.S., we see a massive outflow of migrants from Latin America into the United States, and this is causing a massive amount of tension. Right now, at the time of recording, Texas and a couple dozen states are having this massive disagreement with the federal government because basically the currencies south of the United States are falling so fast, people are desperate to get out and get closer to the monetary capital of the world, Washington, D.C., even though they don't realize that's why. They want the more economic opportunities. They want to leave South Africa and go to the U.S. They want to build their families there because America has more access to the financialization, and therefore greater access to resources, right? A massive American industry, the largest American industry, is financialization, right? And I think that's an interesting thought. What percent of America is actually spent predicting Jerome Powell's actions, right? If 40% of America's economy is the financialization of our economy, maybe 10% of that is spent trying to predict Jerome Powell. I mean, basically Jerome Powell, the central banks are these monetary gods, right? For those 14 African nations, their monetary god is whoever's in control in France, right? Whoever's controlling their currency. They can't control if their supply is finite or infinite. It's not their choice, right? So the same thing, continuing, incarceration rate, all these things continuing to make society worse. The cost of college in the United States is exploding. Obesity is exploding again. They all come back to 1971. Chicken, 1971. Federal debt percent of GDP, 1971. Deficit in the United States, 1971. Same thing with yields in the bond market, right? This is the first time, in the last 45 years, America has suppressed bond rates, right? And now that's beginning to reverse. That's a huge deal. And ultimately, what this all comes to is when the money is a lie, because the money is a promise, if you save this, you'll have more energy in the future, right? And when that is that's actually a lie, or at least a 2% compounding lie per year, when that's a lie, you have an incentive to lie. You have an incentive for more misinformation. Your politicians have an incentive to increase misinformation and propaganda. And just, that's not what's happening. Oh, it's these people that's at fault. It's that color skin that's at fault, or that class, or that religion, or these immigrants, or this person, that person. You have an incentive to lie, which then causes a society built on lies. It causes entitlements. It causes bad actions. It causes a shorter time horizon, which, again, feeds back into itself. And this is ultimately why everyone can feel that like that man I mentioned on the airplane, and talking about the last 15 years, or most Americans talking about the last 15, 20 years. Everyone feels like something's getting worse. And we like to take the easy route, because we're humans, of blaming this group of people or that group of people, when in reality, we're all to blame. Every single one of us is to blame. None of us is perfect. None of us is able to control the monetary supply of the world. So we see this in America. We see this with polarization. We see this with misinformation. I believe that's happening here as well to a very large extent. Unfortunately, we saw this in the years and decades leading up to the World War II. After World War I, we have a massive, multiple hyperinflationary events, obviously the primary one being in modern-day Germany. Unfortunately, that led to the blaming of people groups and then eventually resulted in war across the planet, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. Now, America, again, the greatest country on earth, right, with the strongest currency and the most rights for its citizens, right? Even in our country, here in America, or over in America, we had the Great Depression, right, in the 1930s. We had prices fall, and what would we decide to do to force prices up? We decided to kill a bunch of cows and cattle. That way, if our population, goes a bit hungry, then that way we can keep prices up. Insane, right? We saw the same thing in 2008 in the United States. We see a massive ballooning of everything in the United States on our federal balance sheets, printing money, quantitative easing 1, quantitative easing 2, 3, 4, QE infinity. And this is why inflation here in South Africa has been skyrocketing, is because South Africa's currency, Europe, all their currencies, the euro, right? China, Japan, all these currencies are derivatives of America's, right? So the more we print, the more that we push our numbers onto you in exchange for your oil, in exchange for your diamonds, in exchange for your labor, the more we do that, the more your own currencies will fall. And so the point I'm making here is that as America continues to cannibalize its own currency, unfortunately, I believe the same thing is going to be true to an even more devastating degree. Now, treasury bonds are the real money of the world, right? It's not even U.S. cash. It's actually bonds in many ways, right? Bonds and Bitcoin are making an all-time high. So I wonder what the market is trying to tell us. In the same way that people here in Ghana or South Africa or Kenya would say that it's not that your house is going up, it's that the currency is going down. Again, Americans are yet to understand that, right? You guys are all ahead of them, right? People are yet to understand it's not that Bitcoin is going up in terms of the bonds, it's that the bonds are going down in terms of Bitcoin. This is the blue arrow. There's the prediction I made when I went at my very first Bitcoin podcast. I said that bonds were going to fall 80% in terms of Bitcoin. That's the red dot there. I said it happened within 5 years. There's that red dot. I don't think I'm a genius. I just think it's obvious. Bonds are going to zero in terms of Bitcoin forever, in the same way that everything else is going up forever in terms of political currencies. So again, everything is going to zero in Bitcoin. The stock indices, the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ 500, or excuse me, the NASDAQ, which I mentioned before, it's not that these things are going up forever, it's just they're going up forever in terms of political currency. And many of you are used to using two currencies, right? Many of you are used to using your own local currency here in Africa and also pricing things in terms of the dollar. Us Americans are so biased, and many of you even today have asked, why don't Americans get this yet? And the answer is because Us Americans are so spoiled, we've never had to think in two currencies before. You guys have, right? And so we still have a long way to go in learning about that. And so this is the point I always tell my American friends, is that when you think of stocks in terms of the currency, you think they're going up forever. But really, in terms of Bitcoin, stocks are going down against Bitcoin forever, indefinitely towards zero. The same thing with gold, right? Obviously, South Africa, BRICS. It's a good start. Political currency attached to gold is better than political currency alone. However, gold is trending to zero against Bitcoin. This is Tesla stock, a very aggressive growth company in the United States. Obviously, here in South Africa, there's a lot of discussion with Tesla and Elon Musk potentially having a gigafactory here. Ultimately, though, Tesla stock is going down indefinitely against Bitcoin. Rent and housing, which is a beautiful thing, is going down against Bitcoin forever. And all political currency, this is the best political currency in the world. Again, American dollar, it's going down indefinitely against Bitcoin. The same chart again, right? People in America like Bitcoin because number go up, right? Because, oh, Bitcoin's up 5% today, or it's down 2% today. How do I get rich quick, right? And they fail to realize it's not that Bitcoin is having boom and bust cycles up and up and up forever to the right. It's that the dollar they're pricing it in is going down perpetually forever to the right. Everything is going down against Bitcoin, in the same way all political currencies go down against gold. There's still 1,000x for Bitcoin to reach parity with the rest of the world's assets in terms of today's dollars, right? Not including the printed currency of tomorrow. And ultimately, as we have more energy, I think Bitcoin is the next step for continuing the exponential curve of energy consumption and production that we've been on for the last 2,000 years. And I think Bitcoin is on par as a kind of innovation like the locomotive, like the newspaper, like the discovery of the North Americas from Europe, like the plane or the car or the computer and internet itself. I think Bitcoin is an innovation that's significant and that important. So right now, or at least last year, late 2023 when I made this, that's Bitcoin way up there, that little orange slice. You know, people always ask me if they're too late to Bitcoin. You know, people always ask me, you know, if it's too late. And the beauty is that there are hundreds of millions of people here in Africa. Most of them don't have, you know, bank accounts or ability to save for their retirement like us spoiled Westerners do, right? We think, oh, the whole world uses money. It's like, no, 500 million, you know, roughly 1 in 10 adults has the access to financial services like us Americans do, right? And so it is definitely not too late to Bitcoin because the vast majority of people still don't have property rights. Right? And so the beauty of Bitcoin is that it's going to go from basically nothing, like a little whisper at these tiny little Bitcoin conferences, to something bigger and bigger and bigger, and definitely, and hopefully, eventually consuming all the world. Granted, this will take many decades, right? This is not going to happen overnight. But the beauty, my hope is to go from 500 million to 5 billion adults with property rights. And I think Bitcoin is the tool to get us there. And if you do the math out, what you do in the slide I won't talk about, even very small amounts of Bitcoin, right? And that's the beauty, is that people here in Africa, you know, you may not be able to buy a house that keeps doubling every couple of years because it's such a high barrier to entry. But you can start with maybe $5 a Bitcoin, then $10 a Bitcoin, right? And then just go up from there. The barrier to entry is so low that it is truly open to everyone. So eventually, Bitcoin will go up forever, and definitely in terms of political currency. And this is the beauty with where we're going into the future in regards to custody solutions, right? Right now, the vast majority use single sig as their mechanism for storing Bitcoin. But I believe in the future, multi-sig and Lightning adoption are going to vastly outstrip that of single sig, right? I think we're in the beginning of the end of single sig being the dominant form of custody. I think as we zoom out and out and out, people are going to look at these 3 stages of custody adoption as one and the same as Bitcoin, right? Like, we're going to look at these 3 things as the same thing, but in reality, we're not even, in my opinion, we're not even at the early days of Bitcoin yet, right? The early days of Bitcoin are when people are consolidating UTXOs in their multi-sig, right? I think the true innovation is even beyond that. It's Lightning. You know, it's when there are 3 billion people using this every day, right? We're still only at 60% internet adoption. So in many ways, we are still in the late early days of the internet, right? Almost half the world is still yet to use the internet daily. And I think the same thing with Bitcoin is that it's not even we're early to Bitcoin, it's that we're in the ancient Bitcoin days. So with that said, my encouragement is for people to get off zero. This is why I make lots of content. I think the largest problem in Bitcoin is lack of understanding. Lack of understanding that it's not Bitcoin going up, but everything is going down. So with that said, everyone, encourage you to get off zero. Thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate it. Thanks.
Great. Fantastic. Well done, mate. That was really good. Please give it up for Luke. That was fantastic. Get off zero, everyone. Get off zero. I love the use of calling fiat money political currencies as well. I'm going to steal that one, Luke. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for making the trip here. Now we are going